This lecture will focus on the origins of agriculture and the rise of states. And so this is really the meat of our archaeology subfield because all of the information that we have since that retreat of the last glacial period or the beginning of the broad spectrum revolution, of course, comes from archaeological excavation. So we will ask, as it relates to the first farmers, we'll ask where and when did the Neolithic originate and what its main features were. We will talk about the similarities and differences that are present in the Neolithic economies of both the Old and New World. And we will talk about the costs and benefits that are associated with food production. So, if you recall from the end of our hominin evolution lecture, we talked about the peopling of the Americas dating back as far as maybe even 20,000 years ago. And we talked about the retreat of that last glacial, the Würm Glacial, occurring really between about 12, roughly around 12,000 years ago. And so, what this ushered in was a completely new suite of resources. Up until that point, of course, most early humans had been focusing on megafauna, particularly in areas that were glaciated. And as those glaciers started to recede, we see a wider variety of smaller bodied prey start to emerge. And so we call this, or Kent Flannery has called this, the Neolithic Revolution. And what it did was it allowed us to broaden our diet and to develop a more generalized economy. So instead of specializing in just a few key resources and then following, for example, herds of that animal through their seasonal migration, we began to develop sedentism and what we call central place foraging, where we started to see the rise of early villages and people seasonally taking advantage of different gathered and hunted resources at different times of the year, but staying really in that general vicinity. And so this use of smaller prey is part of what allows that. The Neolithic or the broad spectrum revolution happens anywhere from about 15,000 years ago in the Middle East, 12,000 years ago in Europe. Obviously, it's ushered in at different times based on latitude because of the directions and ways in which those glaciers retreat. And this period um, really encompasses the very tail end of the Upper Paleolithic and the very beginning of the Mesolithic. So, just as Paleolithic referred to stone tools, right? Lithic refers to stone tool technology. Paleo meant old stone tools. The Mesolithic translates into the Middle Stone Age. Lithic still referring to stone tool use. We haven't seen the innovation of metallurgy yet, but um, representing this kind of new broad spectrum foraging, central place foraging kind of lifestyle. The Mesolithic stone tools emphasize microliths. Microlith is literally translated into small stone. And so what this meant was that these stone blades for these tools were incredibly small, especially as compared to those from like the hunting spears of the Upper Paleolithic. And so this can include things like fish hooks and harpoons. We also saw emergence of axes and chisels and gouges. These were specifically for woodworking, for carpentry work. We see new hunting strategies emerge, including bow and arrow technology. With respect to spear throwing, of course, we've got the atlatl, which allows these prehistoric populations to throw their spears even farther. Then bow and arrow hunting represents this advantage of really being able to distance oneself from the prey. So it is related to lower risk of injury, but there are also some key specific kinds of resources that emerge with the Mesolithic that really need bow and arrow as the hunting technology to be able to take advantage of those. So we talked a little bit when we were talking about the peopling of the Americas, about how the coastlines change with the emergence and the retreat of glaciers. And so, of course, when that sea ice expands, when those glaciers expand, that continental shelf region of the coast is exposed. So, what do I mean by this? Well, I'm going to do a little bad drawing here. So, when we think about what's happening on the coastline, right, we've got the shore coming down to the edge of the water. We've got this gradual, kind of not deep part that we call the continental shelf. And then we've got that place that in Nemo is called the drop off, right? And so during times where sea ice and then glaciers have expanded, this is where the water began at the drop off. As soon as we have this warming trend and the glaciers start to retreat, we see the coastline kind of recede a little bit, and water begins to grow to or begins to fill in over this continental shelf area. This is the area where we see things like coral reefs. This is the area where we've got like wetlands. This is the area where we've got lots and lots of kind of smaller bodied fish. So we're not going to get really large things like tuna or swordfish or something in these areas, but there's a lot of kind of under aquatic growth and these coral reefs that provide a wide variety of basically different resources. Okay, this is the time where we start to see foraging for bivalves. It's going to look like a little Mr. Pac-Man or yeah, Pac-Man right there, right? We start to see the emergence of things like oysters and clams and other mollusks. We see economies that can fish with fishing hooks for these smaller bodied fish. We also, in wetland areas specifically, we see nests with, I don't think I can draw this, it's going to be really bad. We see nests with shorebirds. It's supposed to be a duck, all right? And those shorebirds provide two opportunities, right? We can eat them themselves. We can go duck hunting, goose hunting, etc. But they also, because they lay their eggs in nests in wetlands, they provide the opportunity for egg foraging as well. And you're actually going to see a film in a couple weeks that talks about a hunter-gatherer group of in Australia, some of the Aboriginal populations who the story takes place during this season of goose egg hunting, where they would go and gather the eggs from the nest of geese. All right, so it is this waterfowl emergence that um, really strongly favors the development of bow and arrow technology and happens uh, hand in hand with the domestication of dogs. Dogs are the first species that humans domesticated, arguably 20,000 years earlier than any other species of animal, basically. The domestication of dogs goes back 30 to 40,000 years. And um, dogs are incredibly useful for waterfowl hunting. And so if you've ever gone duck hunting, um, of course, in modern times we use firearms, but even bow and arrow duck hunting, right? The dog is kind of has two purposes. The dog flushes the birds out of hiding so that they all fly up and you're able to target them and shoot them. And then the dog also retrieves, right? And so retrievers go back a really long time. They've got that soft bite. They don't tear through the meat. They're able to bring those animals right back to the human hunters. And so that and bows and arrows making it easier to shoot something that's taking off and flying pretty quickly allowed for the exploitation of those waterfowl that are in these coastal regions, these marshlands and such. All right, so with or during the Mesolithic, we see the earliest emergence of farming. We don't see economies in the Mesolithic that are based entirely on farming, but we start to see economies start to transition gradually to farming. And so there are Mesolithic hunters and gatherers. Absolutely. We'll talk specifically about the Middle East and we'll talk about the Natufians. Uh, and they were able to make use of this broad spectrum foraging and able to develop sedentary villages and practice this central place foraging. But there are also Mesolithic economies that maybe farm for about 20% of their calories and then supplement that with hunting and gathering. And so the Mesolithic is really really characterized by these microliths and the emergence of microliths. And what comes after that then will be what we call the Neolithic. All right, so as foragers shifted to smaller species, we've got fish, mollusks, rabbits. These all reproduce quickly and prolifically. So you don't deplete the local, let's say, rabbit population the same way that you would the local caribou population, right? We also start to see a lot of stews being made from fish, from shellfish, and from small animals. So we've got the Jomon culture in Japan that dates back to about 16,000 years ago that used pottery to cook and serve stews of salmon and shellfish. The oldest pottery that we have to date dates back to about 20,000 years before present and has been found in southern China. Pottery is one of those hallmarks of really archaeological excavations, right? And we'll talk about pottery in the sense of as luxury items in just a little bit, but we'll also talk about kind of utilitarian pottery. And so we see this emerging at the same time that we see economies transition to Mesolithic central place foraging. After the Mesolithic comes the Neolithic. The Neolithic is defined as really starting to occur once more than 50% of the diet of people is based on domesticated plants and animals. So these Neolithic economies are economies that are based on food production, no longer food gathering, let's say. So this can include cultivation of crops. It can include a reliance on domesticated animals, both in terms of as components of the diet and also in terms of tools with which you're able to tackle some of your other farming needs. And these kinds of economies are associated with pretty rapid population growth and expansion. So, farming economies, though they may start small, very quickly transition into what we'll talk about in a few moments as early states, and all early states in their nature were expansionist, pushing their boundaries consistently outward. There are some signature Neolithic features that we use in the archaeological record to distinguish this transition point from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic. And these include having evidence of this dependence on cultivation. This can be through animal remains or remains of plants. It can be through seeds that have been preserved, through pollen granules and some genome sampling, etc. Um, it can be through art, right, that we can start to see representation of cultivated plants, like as motifs in their artwork. We see sedentary life. So we had a question on the first exam that was which came first, bipedality or life on the savanna? And the correct answer was bipedality. Well, this second exam, you will have a question that says which came first, sedentism or domestication? The correct answer for that is sedentism. You're not going to plant things if you're nomadic, right? Because you're going to leave those seeds behind. You're not going to be there to tend to them. You may not even be back when it's time to harvest them. So you've got to settle down and start living in sedentary villages before you ever start to plant and intentionally cultivate certain types of crops. And then the third hallmark is this use of ceramic vessels. This was used for storage, this was used for cooking, um, used for a wide variety of features. You know, ceramics aren't used widely by hunter gatherers because, particularly nomadic hunter gatherers, because they're heavy. They're heavy and they're fragile. And so you're going to use, in that kind of context, you're going to use things that don't take up as much weight and are less likely to break as you transport food, for example. You'll use baskets or bags rather than ceramic vessels. Once you settle down, you don't have those same constraints. You don't have to be able to carry everything with you. And so you can start to more widely make and use ceramics. And so this picture represents the characteristic tool type or specifically kind of the mark of what does a Neolithic tool look like as compared to a Mesolithic tool. Neolithic tools are also based on microliths, right? They also start to see the emergence of what we call composite tools, where you take a bunch of microliths and embed them in something. So, for example, if we had a bunch of stone points that we embedded in like an antler or a jaw or a piece of wood, right? You end up with a tool that looks kind of like this, which is very much like a saw, right? So there were composite tools during the Mesolithic as well, but what we start to see with the Neolithic is a specific technique of grinding and polishing stone tools. So here we have a hammerhead, and here we've got two polished axes. Okay, the rough edges are kind of polished out because you've ground down those edges. So with grinding versus just something like pressure flaking, which was the technique that was used for, I mean, for arrowheads as well as for like spear points and such. Once we develop a system of grinding, we can get a more symmetrical, kind of finer, thinner cutting edge on things so that you can use something like the equivalent of a whetstone to wear down the edges of those stone tools so that you get a uniform cutting blade, which can be incredibly more effective than things that have just been pressure flaked and we don't have that kind of smooth, sharp edge. The other thing that comes with the Neolithic is we start to up our reliance on grain, and at first this is wild grains, but eventually we of course transition to domesticated grains, and we see then kind of like a mortar and pestle or a grinding stone that ends up with an incredibly polished surface because you're constantly using some other stone to kind of grind or process that grain down into a fine flour.